Hello, and welcome to the continuation of the Cruise Consulting free pitch deck creation course. Today, we're going to talk about a relatively important and sometimes somewhat underappreciated slide, the competition slide. If you are new to this course, we'll give you a quick background on who we are. If you have been following along, just skip ahead about 30 seconds and we'll get into the more meat of the discussion. For those of you who are new, I am Healy Jones. I am the VP of FP&A at Cruise Consulting, one of the leading accounting and finance consulting firms serving venture capital-backed startups. Our clients raise over $1 billion a year. It's part of my job to help prepare our clients for the fundraise. I am joined by Haya Kamps. Haya is not only a TechCrunch reporter, former venture capitalist and startup founder who has raised money. He's also one of the better known pitch deck consultants in Silicon Valley and the author of Pitch Perfect, which you can get on Amazon. Haya, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great. This is the competition slide. I love it. Let's dig in here. Everybody follow along on cruiseconsulting.com/pitch-deck. Let's do it. What is the what is the competition slide for, Haya?
The competition slide is your opportunity to kind of, typically you've done your market size and that kind of stuff piece. Now you get to really position yourself against the other operators in the market. I think it's a really helpful slide to help remind people why this even exists, right? So I occasionally work with founders who say that there is no competitors, and they're almost certainly wrong, right? There's going to be something.
That's a big red flag. That if you're a venture capitalist, when I was a VC and I heard someone say there were no competitors, my first thought is this person may not know what they're talking about. Or the second thought is, well, maybe there's no market. Like neither of those two little flags are the ones you want to go up in somebody's mind there while they're talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this is the thing. If people are willing to pay money to solve this problem, there is a competitor. It may not be obvious, right? There might be some really obscure ways that these things are competitors. But if people are not willing to pay for solving the problem, it means that you essentially don't have a market and you don't have a product. Anyway, for most companies, they know that there are competitors, and it helps to prove that there's a market that people are willing to pay. It proves that you have a way to kind of, you have somebody to steal customers from. You can compare yourself to the other competitors. Like, are they using a slightly different business model? Are they using a different customer acquisition funnel? What are they doing for customer acquisition? Just looking at their adverts and what they're running can really help you shape how you run your advertising campaign. And so it's a really good way to kind of find out both what the market looks like, but also to develop your blue ocean strategy, right? Don't go and fight in the red bloody ocean with the sharks. Find out where you can compete, where they are less active, if it's early enough in your business journey, and you can actually carve out a slice of the market that way.
For sure. So sometimes I found when presenting this slide, nothing really happens. Everyone nods and you move on. Other times, this is a gateway to a pretty important strategic discussion around how the market is structured, what features or go-to-market strategy customers want, willingness to pay, market size, and things like that. So this slide can sometimes start some pretty important strategic discussions. Sometimes those discussions should be held on different slides. So if the VC really is digging in on the go-to-market of the competitors after you're on the slide, it may make sense to jump to your go-to-market slide so you can showcase how you're going to market, and then keeping in the back of your mind you're differentiating, you compare your differentiators. But overall, pretty much every company should have competitors or alternatives. So even as thinking the famous example, of course, of Ford saying his customers would want a faster horse instead of a car, but Ford's competitors were horses, right? So it would have been completely acceptable for him to have mentioned horses on his slide. And then additionally, if there were companies that had brand recognition that were doing cars, probably should mention those as well. But everybody should have competitors, and it is a sign that there's a real market. It's a very positive sign to have competitors. Competition is good.
Yeah.
And in my mind, the best kind of competition for a startup to have are the big, slow incumbents who are probably not likely to embrace technology, faced with the innovator's dilemma, et cetera, et cetera. So in an ideal world, you're innovating in a space where there's big, slow incumbents where you can come from underneath them or from a different angle.
Yeah, absolutely.
So talk a little bit more about putting alternatives on this slide. So instead of just saying that, I'm selling spoons and here are spoon competitors, maybe spoons is a silly analogy, but that does make sense to kind of talk about how the market is currently being served if it's a different type of a
Yeah,
solution.
I think there are two things here. One is predicates and one is competitive alternatives. Predicates are like, okay, how can you compare this market? So I love using Peloton for this because, when Peloton came along, there were already exercise bikes and there were already spin classes. And they kind of said, hey, what we're doing is we're taking the spin classes that people have in person and the exercise bikes that you have at home, and we smush them together with content, right? And it was kind of genius. I mean, it was very hard to explain, but by using the two predicates, you can explain how the product makes sense and how it makes sense in the marketplace. Because you can kind of say, okay, what's the market for exercise bikes? What's the market for, spin classes? And you kind of fudge something in between there. And for their particular thing, I'm getting a little bit into product here, but for their particular thing, they're like, look, there's lots of stay-at-home moms who really want to go to spin class but can't do it, and it's very hard to get on an exercise bike without any sort of encouragement. Another one, I think in one of the previous episodes, you made a joke about sock folding robots, and I feel like there are a lot of competitive alternatives for sock folding robots, right? Maybe you have a laundry service, maybe you have a maid, maybe you just keep your socks in a giant pile at the foot of your bed, whatever
It's a
works
great
for
idea.
you.
I'm going to follow that one. Yeah,
it works great for me. But, there are lots of alternatives here. And so the question becomes, okay, are these alternatives good enough? Like, they don't have to be perfect, but if you're starting to charge money for something, your product better be a lot better than the other alternatives for people to go, oh yeah, that habit I had, I'm now going to change into using your sock folding robot.
Right.
And so all of those kind of alternatives, and these are slightly silly, right? But there are pretty much alternatives for absolutely everything out there. There's for cars, there are alternatives. There's public transportation. So if you're the first person developing a new type of car, you better explain why your specific car is better than any other car out there or better than public transportation.
Right. So again, for this slide, what you're doing is you're proving that there's a market. You're proving that people are willing to pay for the solution or to solve this problem.
Yeah,
so that's a good thing. You're helping the investor become comfortable with, hey, I'm not just shouting into a void. There's actually something out there that people are willing to pay for.
Yeah.
You're showing your differentiation and perhaps provide, like, explaining why or how you have a moat or some sort of a unique competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just as importantly as those first two things, you're showing to the investor that you understand the market, you understand the market dynamics, you understand what customers are thinking about when they're making a purchase, you understand how they want to make the purchase and go to market, you're understanding what the major competitors are doing. Now, you don't have to get into all of those details on this slide, but if you're challenged on any, it would probably happen or may happen on this slide. Use this slide as a foil for you preparing yourself to answer those questions, regardless of where they come up inside of your presentation. Regardless of where the investor asks you, think about it as you put this slide together.
Yeah, you touched on this slightly earlier, but occasionally you are entering a market where there is an enormous competitor, right? That's a household name that everybody's heard of. If you're about to start launching an electric car, somebody's going to mention Tesla at some point, right? And so you have to be able to describe how you're different. If you're exactly the same thing, then the incumbent is going to win. There has to be some sort of edge that you have over your competitor. And that edge runs pretty deep. You have to understand their business models. You have to understand their products. You have to understand their sales strategy. You have to understand maybe even their fundraising, right? How much money do they have? Like, if they've raised $3 billion and you're showing up and go, yeah, cool, we can do this, you're going to have a really hard time, because even the investor looks at this and goes, well, unless there's something really special here, you're not going to be able to take on this enormous incumbent without a formidable amount of funding.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right. So in general, every time we talk about the slides, we try to explain what stage company needs to have the slide, because sometimes it's not necessarily applicable for a very early stage company or later stage company. However, every stage business pitching to raise venture capital funding needs a competition slide.
Yeah, agreed.
Everyone needs one. Now, sometimes they're almost folded a little bit into the market size. Uber did that in an example that we shared earlier, where they talked about the taxi market. Yeah. However, I would recommend you have an explicit competition slide unless there's something super unique about your business. So yeah, you want a competition slide. So let's talk about, what are you trying to prove if you're early stage and not really generating much revenue yet?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting. I think the slide might look exactly the same for those two stages, but the story is different, right? At a very early stage, the story you're telling is like, this is the competitive landscape, and here's how we're going to get foothold in this market. You just need a toe somewhere so you can start climbing. When you're a much later stage, now you're talking about, okay, we have a foothold in the market. We are a real player. How are you going to do conquest sales, i.e. steal customers from your competitors, or how we're going to do market expansions, and what does that mean to the competitive landscape? And I think really thinking about how you tell that part of the story is a helpful way of structuring this slide.
Right. And so at the early stage, you'll probably use a lot of like, we believe, or we think that XYZ will happen. Once you're generating significant revenue, and more likely to be a later stage company raising funding at that point, you should be able to talk to more specific anecdotes or data around how customers appreciate your product or differentiate your product versus the competition.
Yeah.
You should be able to say things like 20% of customers choose our product over this particular competitor because of this reason, and the other 80% choose it because of this.
Yeah.
Right? So as you get later stage, you should have data backup, at least in your mind, that you can use to really explain why, hey, this is the feature that's doing it, or this is the sales process, or this pricing, or this messaging. These are the things, and hopefully they tie to something that, again, is a moat or a key differentiator that is sustainable over time.
Yeah, and if you're a consumer product, of course, this is where you make sure you keep an eye on your own reviews and those of your competitors. If you are a B2B company with smaller but larger deals, you will have people in your pipeline where you lose the sale. Make sure you pick up the phone and call them to find out, hey, you picked Google over us, no hard feelings, but we're a young company, can I just talk to you briefly? I want to figure out why. And if you start getting a shape for like, hey, the companies who have this particular need actually end up going to this particular competitor, that means you need to do one of two things. One, stop marketing to them, right? You're going to lose all those sales. There's no point. Or shift your product so you can actually have a more compelling argument for the customer choosing you. And when you're in an investor meeting and they say, okay, well, you have a huge incumbent here that gets lots of sales. Why are you losing sales to them? It's a very good idea to have a good answer there.
Exactly. Great. And so one thing that we definitely want to point out here, like a big red flag that we're going to mention again, is it's a huge risk if you say you have no competition.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really tempting to say that as a startup founder, because you probably are creating something unique. You probably are creating something that hasn't exactly existed in the world before, right? That's what you're doing. You're a startup founder, but you hopefully are solving a real problem, and businesses who might buy that, or people who might buy that, are not stupid. They would be solving that problem somehow already. It's not as if they have a bleeding wound that they've been ignoring for their entire life and that has been ignored for the past 20 years. If there is a critical problem that you're solving, folks must have attempted to solve it in some way, shape, or form.
Totally. And we talked about Airbnb in our market size slide, and I think it actually makes sense here too. Airbnb had a real challenge because nobody really believed that there was going to be a market for this, but there was no risk. They could very clearly point to competitors, right? There's hotel chains, there is youth hostels, there is even couchsurfing.com. I don't know if that still existed, but that existed back then. And so they could say, look, these are the alternatives that people are using. We think we can start scraping off some of those customers and putting them on a platform and adding some safety and adding all these extra features that you don't get. That is a really clever way of talking about your competitor when you are in that very rare situation that the market doesn't exist. But in most cases, there's going to be probably direct competitors or solutions that your customers are already using to solve the exact problem you're trying to solve for them.
So I'm going to actually jump into the Airbnb competition slide, which, am I sharing the right screen? I hope I am. Can you see it? Okay, great. Perfect. So we link out to some pitch decks that we think are really great. And this is one. And so let's focus a little bit on what Hai is saying here, right? So Airbnb really was pretty unique and actually slightly crazy. Like, people are going to stay in your house. What? Right. So they did a nice job with their 2x2, and we'll get into the structure of the slide in a second, explaining how there are existing companies and how they're different, right? So they are like some of the hotels.com, Orbitz, I don't know if VRBO is big bet there or not, but Craigslist, the VC can orient themselves on this slide around those well-known logos. And just having the logos correctly spaced on this slide can help tell the story to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Folks understand Craigslist, folks understand hotels.com, they get Orbitz. So seeing them triangulated like this can help the venture capitalists start to feel more comfortable that people are willing to pay money for this and that there's a possibility of differentiating, right? They understand that Craigslist is very different than Orbitz.
Yeah.
Therefore, it seems possible that you could have something that is differentiated against those solutions as well. So it's just really helpful slide.
Yeah.
I think it probably is.
Oh, go. Sorry.
Oh yeah. I was going to say maybe you start to get into the meat of how you actually build this slide now.
Yeah, totally.
So I think the 2x2 is the most popular, right?
And that's what this is. It's the 2x2, or sometimes known as like the crosshair. And you typically have two axes, right? In this case, offline and online transactions. Reading this now in 2022, it's kind of hilarious to think that anything would be an offline transaction, but there you go. And then affordable and expensive. It makes perfect sense to split it up that way for the story that they're trying to tell, right? And then they've just lobbed everything into these categories. Now, personally, at this point, I would probably think security is much more important. Like, are you staying with a serial murderer, or are you staying with somebody who is safe? And I think so the online offline doesn't make sense anymore today, but people are worried about their safety, and so you could have the same crosshair, but tell different stories depending on what you put in the different categories. So think really carefully about how your company differentiates itself. You're always going to be in the top right because that's how these things work. But then think about, how you tell this part of the story. And what often happens is that people say, okay, we're looking at offline to online, we're looking at affordable to expensive. Let me quickly talk you through them. You start top right, and you kind of go counterclockwise around. You go, okay, this is what happens here. This is what happens here. This competitor is interesting. We're keeping an eye on them, but we think they're moving in that direction. They're getting more expensive because they're taking that slice of the market. We found a way here that by leveraging empty bedrooms and by leveraging online platforms and booking and eBay style reviews, we think we're creating something here that is completely unique. And by telling the story that way, you can actually really draw people in and say, okay, well, you're not saying anything bad about any of the competitors, which we'll mention later, but there's a really interesting way that you can use this as a narrative device to really kind of nail home this part of the story and say, look, yes, there are competitors, but we are offering something that nobody else is doing.
That's right. Yeah. And so hopefully this helps reinforce the fact that you've got a market and how your product is different and how you're going to go to market. This slide really is one of those ones that's sort of like a linchpin. Let's show a few other examples. So as we've mentioned before, we have created 2 free pitch deck templates that you can download off cruiseconsulting.com/pitch-deck. One is a consumer focused and one is a B2B focused pitch deck example. Again, don't judge us on these businesses. We're not starting these businesses. We're just trying to make some slides you can use. The first one is a beer delivery service, possibly questionable business model, but does create the opportunity to show how to build a competitive slide in a market where there's not a ton of direct competitors. So Haya, do you want to talk about how you built this slide here?
Yeah, so I was kind of thinking about, like, for this admittedly very silly company, how do you tell the story of the competitive landscape, right? And so it's like, the amount of work you have to do. So ease of use or convenience is kind of the value. And you can think about all of these things as USPs, right? The unique selling point or the value proposition of your product. Beersub is top right. The value prop is premium quality and no hassle, right? If you think about the Airbnb one, the value prop was online. Oh, you're switching to it?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. The value prop is it's affordable and it's online, right? And it makes it a very, very simple way of talking about the value prop or the USP of your company. Now, for the Beersub company, premium quality and no hassle at all. And then now with this one, I would actually tell the story that way. Hey, we're completely unique. We're the only premium quality microbrewery delivery service that makes it super easy for you to discover new beers. What are the competitors? Well, you can go to your local brewery, but that's a pain in the butt. They have weird opening hours. They only have their own brews, and you don't really get that much experience. You can go to your local supermarket, but it's lots of work. You have to go there. You don't really get any guidance. The liquor store, well, maybe they have some people who are beer enthusiasts, but it's really hit and miss. And, they're generally cheap for a reason. And so you kind of, and then there's Hopsy. Hopsy is the one direct competitor that exists in this space. And because it's such a direct competitor, for this particular slide, I created a second slide that does like a direct one-to-one comparison for how it's different. Now, you should be prepared to talk to this, as we said earlier, for all of your competitors, but because Hopsy is such a straight up direct competitor, we're like, okay, how is it different, and how can we tell the story? Now, I'm being a little bit flippant here, like at the bottom, good for impressing, lol, are you kidding? Would I put that on a VC slide? Probably not, but it depends on the voice of the company, right? If you have a company that is like kind of loosey-goosey about how it uses language, it is maybe okay to use that, but you have to be very careful about how
You want to be careful. I think actually, if I was to do this slide, I might go to one of those online review sites where maybe they have a 3-star rating or something and say 3 stars, and then something in parentheses that's clearly you've taken from one of the reviews that a person has put there. However, you want to be careful because you don't want the VC to say how, like, if you don't have a solution for that issue, you're going to get egg on your face as well, right? So if you say something like the beer is delivered stale, right, that's why they stink, and you don't have an answer for how your beer gets delivered not stale, guess what? You just shot yourself in the foot.
Absolutely. And in this one, though, the reason why this kind of works is that you have the very specific differentiation and value prop for your company. The beer dispenser is different. The kegs, it works out way, way, way cheaper because you're working with bigger kegs. The selection, what is the selection for the different things? Recommendation engine. So I think for this particular company, the recommendation engine is actually is the magic sauce, and Hopsy doesn't have that at all. So you can kind of talk to each of these and you say, look, when we do our marketing, for some of our customers, they care about cost. We can do cost-based marketing. For some of the customers, they care about the recommendation engine or about beer connoisseurs. They're not like for random keg parties. They're for people who really care about beer. And so you can actually talk a little bit about here. Yes, there are competitors, but here's how I would market to the customers using our differences. And you can treat this slide however you want, but you can get really good conversations going with your VCs. And sometimes they will also come up with really insightful questions at this level.
Right. So from a design perspective, if I was to have built this slide and the recommendation engine was the key differentiator that I wanted to hang my hat on, I would have put that either at the top or the bottom of this table so that it's it's easy to have your eyes linger on it instead of burying it in the middle.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why why I don't offer design services. Oh God, I'm an awful designer.
But from a design perspective, I'm very happy that you shared this slide because a matrix like this is a comparison table is a great way to do your competition slide as well. Yeah. So if you have a few competitors, you can put them in here. I also recommend that if you think that the competition is going to be a big part of your discussion, that maybe you have a 2x2 in your main part of your deck, and then in the appendix, you have something like this where you're laying out the critical competitors. And it's also okay to say group some of the competitors together if there are similar ones. So if there are 3 incumbents that have relatively similar solutions, lump them together in one column and then put the more interesting ones into the other columns. That's fine. You need to use your judgment on that, but it is possible.
Haley, I have a story there.
Okay, go for it.
I called you Haley. That's rude. Haley, I have a story there. In one of my previous startups, I was doing something in virtual events, and by the time like every single VC conversation I had, they were like, the competition, right? Back then, Hopin, which wasn't big yet, they were about to become a multi-billion-dollar company, and we saw them coming, kind of thing. My competitor slides was 2 slides long and had 50 competitors on it. And I grouped them together. Like, these look like they're competitors, but Zoom really is a competitor because it's used for this kind of thing. These look like they're competitors, but they're not because they're used for collaborative work. And that's not really what we're for. And so we basically, I was able to put away something like 40 competitors by just grouping them together and explaining why they were different. And then I had one slide that just talked about the direct competitors. And it turned out to be a really powerful way of just, because otherwise we just kept getting stuck on a competitor slide. And they're like, oh, have you thought about it? Or have you done? I'm like, guys, we're having the wrong conversation here. And so it's one of the very few times where I ended up having 2 competitor slides just because there were so many of them.
So in the venture world, there are occasionally, and they're often consumer, although I'm starting to see it also on the enterprise side, there are very many they're copycat companies.
Yeah.
So if you are launching a business or raising funding for a business in a market where there are a dozen competitors who've all raised funding in the past year or so, that strategy is a good idea because you are going to get questions around, is the market too crowded? How do people differentiate? What's your moat? So being able to clump together and potentially having two slides can show that you're paying attention to the market and help prove that you feel like you can differentiate in what is becoming a crowded market.
Mhm. And
That's
in
really
that
great. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And in that very specific example, actually, what we ended up doing was white label events. And so there were a small handful of competitors and they were 10 times more expensive. And so what our leverage ended up being was like, well, yes, we run $100,000 events, but you can change everything. It can be completely customized. It will be completely indistinguishable from your own platform, except it's a platform. So for people who really cared about brand and people who really cared about owning the full story, the full narrative all the way through. I'm under very strict NDAs, but you will have definitely heard of the brands who used us. But yeah, it was really powerful. And that became a really powerful story for us, for the VCs. It's like, hey, you know who uses us? These three brands you've heard of. You know
That's
why?
great.
Because
Yeah.
nobody else can offer what we offer. And
So
it turned out to be a really good part of
great.
the story.
Yeah. So if you're in a competitive market, just be prepared to go on the slide. This is really important. Now there's one other structure. So we showed you the 2x2 and we showed you the comparison table. There's another structure called a market map, which I haven't found a good example of in a long time. I did one a very long time ago when I raised funding for one of the companies I was with, but I don't have that example. So that is a third way to do it. That is probably the least common. If that's something you like, VCs will be okay with it as long as you're able to speak to it. Now let's flip over to, we showed a couple examples that are consumer focused. Now let's flip to the enterprise example that we made. This is for a company called 4P, which is selling a CRM, customer management bookings solution into plumbers. Again, don't judge us on the company. We're just trying to make pretty slides that you can use that tell a story so that you can create a great pitch deck. So Haya, here we have a classic 2x2. Talk to me about this thing.
Yeah, and so the idea here, and again, please don't judge us. I don't know that much about plumbing. The idea was to keep, so plumbing is a very kind of vocational job, right? And the few plumbers I know tend to not be particularly technical. And so the assumption I'm making here is that in order to make a product, it has to be super specialized. So it really works for the use case, and it has to be relatively easy to use. And so I was looking at the kind of the landscape, and it turns out there are some direct competitors. ServiceTitan is a very well-reviewed product in this space. And it takes some setting up, it takes some configuring to get it running. So it is pretty specialized. And then you have things like FieldEdge and Jobber that are more for general contracting work. And I guess you also have kind of the Thumbtack type apps where it's just for kind of dispatching and getting work. And then further on the left, like the more generic tools, you could use SAP for this. It would be fantastically overkill to use an SAP CRM for a plumbing business, but you could. Salesforce, again, is infinitely customizable. You can probably build a very good solution based on Salesforce, but you have to be technical enough to be able to build your solution around that. And then there's more kind of generic kind of CRM tools like Zoho and all the other, like there's thousands of CRM tools. You can probably use most of them for plumbing. But the argument we're making in this particular pitch is like, look, this one is you sign up, the next day you're ready to go, right? There's it's easy to use and it's super specialized for plumbing. You just give us the profile of the kind of plumbing business you are. You give us the name of your various plumbers and their availability, and you're good to go. So I think in this particular competitive landscape story, if I also do the research on the pricing points and the marketing and all that kind of stuff, you can tell a really compelling story here for why 4P is actually a really compelling competitor to this pretty crowded landscape.
So a few awesome things on here. One, we're showing very large companies as competitors. I think SAP and Salesforce are probably top 10 global software companies. That's not a problem. In fact, the secret undertone here is, hey, we could exit to one of them if we really do well.
Oh,
right. So that's actually pretty amazing. Like the secret undertone of this slide is, if there's big companies on here, who can I sell to in 10 years if I'm kicking butt?
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. But also you're saying, we understand this market better. So this is on the one hand, it's speaking to what the customer would want. Our understanding of this customer is that they need something easy to use, and that's what we're focusing on. I think the second part of this is that it's talking about the niche or the go-to-market, and now this company will eventually expand into stuff that's not plumbing, but we're starting with plumbing. So this slide ties neatly into several other important parts of your slide. I guess as I'm looking at this, the one design thing I have with this slide is the 4P logo is actually almost like too far up and to the right. Yeah, it's almost invisible. So I would, in fact, I guess I could probably just edit this right. Can I just edit this and pull this down? I would probably put it right here and maybe even like make it a little
welcome to live editing of slides.
There we go. Oh no, I messed it up. I got to move the form. But anyway, this is probably where I would put it so that it's like super kind of clear what you're doing.
I like that logo better anyway. You did a good job there. See, you're hired as a designer.
All right, that's good. Well, that's what I'll be in my final life. Yep. So I do have another example that I'd like to show, and we link to this off of the Cruise Consulting pitch deck as well. This is for a company that I don't know very much about called Front, but the CEO was kind enough to write a nice Medium post about their slide deck that I think is really helpful. Again, I link out to this, and I'll just make this bigger so you can see it. A thing that they do that I think is great is that, okay, so they compete with Salesforce and they compete with Amazon and they compete with Microsoft, but they don't just put the Salesforce logo and the Amazon logo and the Microsoft logo. They actually put the specific division that they compete to, which on the one hand, you're proving that there's big competitors who potentially could buy you. And when big competitors do stuff, there's a market, particularly when they have divisions. But on the other hand, you're narrowing down the scope to the point where it feels a lot more achievable and understandable. So if they had just put Amazon on here, it would take the VC a few minutes to really orient. Like, well, Amazon does all kinds of stuff. Like, my
are you opening a bookshop?
Yeah, exactly. Is it books, or my kid watches the like cartoons on Amazon? Is that what it is? Or like, oh no, wait, it's Amazon Web Services. I got it now. Instead, they just put AWS on here. And it's like, boom, VC can hone in on the specific thing that the big company does that you're competing against. So that is the reason why I wanted to show this slide. I thought they did a really nice job with that.
And it's interesting too, because they're kind of the axis here is good or bad messaging experience and business ready or consumer, right? So really what they're designing here is a business ready, great messaging experience company. Well, I know of a company that exists in that space now. Slack is huge there, and HipChat is huge there. And there's a whole bunch of other ones that showed up and are doing stuff there. And interestingly, Twilio, which is now bad messaging service and consumer, has actually fully moved up to the top right now. Twilio has really good deep integration type services. So remember, like we've mentioned before, don't just reuse your competitor slide. Well, if they were trying to raise another round of money here, Twilio has moved, AWS has moved, Messenger has now got a business product, so that has moved to business ready. Slack should be on here. So don't get lazy.
Slack was acquired by Salesforce as well. So as part of proving that you know what's going on in the market, if you're in this, this slide deck is from 2016. So
I'm not giving the guy a hard time.
It makes definite sense for the time that it was built. But if you are in this space and you are not aware that Salesforce acquired Slack, the VC is going to look at you kind of funny. You need to know what's going on in the competition. I think, Hayo, you mentioned when we were doing our warm-up call that you had an example of a company that talked with you that was not aware of the competition, and it would have been very bad for them in a pitch if they
would have actually been laughed out of the room, which would have been very sad. So after my book came out, I have a ton of like 20-minute calls with founders, right? And many of them are not really ready to start raising money yet, but I love talking to founders. I love having conversations. And so I'm very happy to take those calls. There's this one guy who came to me, super enthusiastic. He was clearly a gym buff. He was sitting with a bunch of exercise equipment behind him. And he was like, okay, I've got this great idea for an exercise bike where you can put an iPad, and then the iPad can play exercise type videos to keep you motivated, because that's important. And I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. How do you compare to Peloton? And he looks at me and goes, who? And I was like, very funny. He goes, no, seriously, who? And it turns out he had never heard of Peloton. He'd built most of a product and had the full idea. And I was like, okay, at least Google the market you're in, or occasionally, and that was at the time when Peloton advertising was absolutely everywhere. And I was just like, okay, how did you not find your biggest competitor? And my heart went out to him, because clearly he'd done a lot of work here, but a couple of Google searches could stop him from having to try and found a company that has a really powerful incumbent.
And it also, you would hope that this individual was talking to folks who throwing his idea out to people, right?
Yeah.
This
Who goes, hey, like
sometimes
Peloton.
this is sometimes a problem for founders who are so secretive that they won't tell anyone what they're working on, and
Mhm.
therefore they miss common market intel because they're so kind of focused internally and not listening and getting input from people in
Yeah.
their network. So,
But just to kind of extrapolate slightly from that, right? So that was an extreme example, but I do get examples like that, both on the competitor slide and in general quite a lot, where it turns out that you need to be out there talking to people, talk to customers. If this guy had spoken to 5 customers or had 1 advisor or anything, somebody would have mentioned Peloton to him. So the fact that he got far enough to build a product, build a pitch deck, and then contacted me to go and raise money, that was the first time he found out about Peloton. It's a really, really bad sign. I actually declined to work with him. I was like, hey, I'm really sorry. Do some more research and go do your thing.
So I think that
And
gets
it
us to
happens.
the common issues here. That is one of the top issues where you're missing major competitors,
Mhm.
or heaven forbid, the venture capitalist knows a lot more about this market than you do.
Yeah, like if you get to your competitor slide and the VC mentions this actually happened to me with the virtual events platform. Every time I had a conversation with a VC, they mentioned a new competitor that I hadn't heard of because there were 90, right?
Right.
And at some point I just gave up. I was like, okay, right, I'm going to spend 2 days researching every possible competitor out there and do all the research and write up a full thing. But yeah, you have to know your competitive landscape. And that doesn't mean that every single competitor has to appear on the slide, but you can't get blindsided by somebody mentioning a brand new competitor to you in a pitch meeting. That's just really unprofessional.
Agreed. And then I think the second part of that is, if this is a huge problem, not and the market is solving it in some other way with some other solution, not being able to speak to that solution or not being aware of that solution.
Yeah.
Right. So not considering what the alternatives are.
Yeah, competitive
I think
alternatives are crucial to know about, and you can actually put them on your slide. There's nothing wrong with taking a kind of competitor and putting it on there just to say, look, I'm aware they exist. I'm aware this is how the problem is currently being solved, but it's 10 times more expensive than what we're doing. So don't worry about them. It works really well as part of a conversation.
Yeah, great. So the other major common issue I've seen is where you bash the competition. You just rip into them, you shred them, and you're cruel. Trying to think of the right word here, but just to the point where you almost seem like you're blind to what your potential own faults might be.
Yeah.
And
I think it's really unclassy. And there's 2 big ways that this will come back and bite you. One, it's a really small world. If you're talking to an investor in this space, there's a pretty good chance that they've met or know the other founders, right? And they are not stupid. They got this far. They're not stupid. So calling them stupid or calling them clueless is not helpful, especially if they're a little bit ahead of you. And the other thing is, this founder might potentially be an exit for you at some point, right? If you are bad mouthing a competitor who might eventually buy you, they may just choose not to buy you out of spite. I think, like, if you are a jerk, people don't want to work with you. And that could actually get in the way of your acquisition. If that rumor gets out that you're a horrible person, don't be a horrible person. It's really easy.
And in particular, like, bashing startups is you could look very petty if you're not.
And we're all just trying our best, right?
Exactly. Right. However, you do want to be able to say why you're different than the competitor. You want to say why customers choose you. Yep. So there's a fine line here when you're asked about a specific customer and so for Cruise, for example, we have a few competitors that are pretty well known, and we don't bash the competition, but we do say that, we've had 1,000 clients and we've only lost 2 to this particular competitor, and yet we get 5 of their customers a month. Yeah, we're maybe not bashing the competitor, but we're kind of making it clear that there's we're a little bit better, right?
And there's a really good expression in British English that is fit for purpose, right? You don't ride a road bike on a mountain bike path. You don't ride a mountain bike to do Tour de France. And there might be competitors out there that solve a similar problem, but for a different clientele. That is fine. You don't have to bash them for it. You can just say, well, it's a different competitor. They're doing something slightly different. I wish them luck. Have fun. We're going to go do our thing over here. That is a much better way of approaching this part of the story. And especially if you can link that with your strategy for go-to-market or your fundraising strategy or your customer strategy. Like, this is a very strategic slide. It's not just a list of companies you Googled in the last 10 minutes.
Right. So if this slide is just a bunch of logos, and even a bunch of logos kind of in a 2x2, and that's it, it's not far enough. You need to be prepared to have this slide be very strategic. You need to have thought about this. You need to understand how you will politely differentiate your superiority versus the competitors, how you will politely and hopefully convincingly explain why there's a moat.
Yeah.
It's really important. And then again, this is important for your story arc. It needs to mesh with your product, your go-to-market, your traction, all that. So this is underappreciated slide, I'd say.
And in particular, make sure you know the business model. I think a lot of the time, especially if you're differentiating on that front, like if you're a SaaS company in a traditional software space, or if you're if you have like a rental model or a subscription model in a space where it's like usually people buy to own, make sure that you know what your competitors are doing. And if they're launching something new that encroaches on you, you need to be able to speak to that, why that is a problem for you or why it wouldn't be. Because this is the kind of stuff, the business model piece, that is so important for how your company is going to work vis-a-vis your competitors. And the extension of that, how venture fundable you are. Like ultimately, this is all about the investors seeing an exit. If they can't see an exit happening in their wildest, most wonderful dollar-colored dreams, it's going to be a short conversation.
That's awesome. So I think that actually can bring us to the summary here. So this is a critical slide, and there may not be a ton of design work that goes into this slide, but the thinking that goes into this slide, you should be thinking a lot as you put together this slide.
Yeah.
Investors know that competition is not the end of the world, and the best VCs actually like competition because it's proving that there's a market and there's potential exit, as you just highlighted, right? So this slide should be used to help advance your story, to explain how you're better and different, explain how you know the market really well, and if needed, tie or jump to other parts of your presentation. Don't be afraid to have an appendix where we have a lot more detail on the competition and how you're different. But I think the most important takeaway of this is don't be afraid to have competition. You want to show competition, you want to show the alternatives, and you're going to prove how you're different, better, and get the market.
Yep.
Perfect.
Love it.
All right, well, everybody, thank you so much. And hopefully you're enjoying this course and following along.
Thanks for tuning in.